In 2025, German students are learning about World War II through virtual reality tours of concentration camps and AI-powered survivor testimonies that previous generations never experienced. This represents a fundamental shift from traditional textbook learning to immersive digital education that began transforming classrooms in 2024. Japan has taken a strikingly different path. Despite international pressure, Japanese history textbooks still dedicate only 19 of 357 pages to the period from 1931 to 1945, maintaining their long-standing approach to wartime education. Meanwhile, Arab nations are restructuring how they teach the Crusades. Countries like Jordan now cover these medieval conflicts in both 6th and 11th grade curricula, presenting perspectives that often contrast sharply with Western educational approaches. The changes reflect broader global tensions over how nations balance historical accuracy with national narratives in their classrooms. Germany's revolutionary digital approach to teaching World War II. Germany has embraced this challenge through a complete transformation of how World War II reaches its classrooms. Students in Berlin now engage in structured debates where they argue from both angel and devil perspectives on historical decisions, forcing them to understand the complexity of moral choices during wartime. Teachers guide these discussions while students visit actual concentration camp sites, creating direct connections between classroom theory and historical reality. This represents a complete departure from the textbook-based approach that dominated German education for decades. The shift began in earnest during 2024 when the Conference of Education Ministers approved funding for comprehensive digital learning platforms across all 16 federal states. The change wasn't gradual. It was implemented rapidly after studies showed that traditional methods were failing to create emotional connections with historical events for Generation Z students who had grown up entirely in the digital age. The new approach emphasizes contemporary connections to historical events, though educators carefully balance historical accuracy with age-appropriate content. Students examine how propaganda techniques from the Nazi era appear in modern contexts, learning to identify manipulation tactics across different media formats. This focus on media literacy extends beyond historical study, teaching students to evaluate information sources and recognize bias in contemporary reporting. Coordinating these digital resources across Germany's decentralized education system required unprecedented cooperation between the 16 states. Each lander maintains its own curriculum standards, but they now share common digital platforms that provide consistent access to primary source materials and historical documentation. The system respects regional autonomy while ensuring that all German students receive comprehensive Holocaust education as mandated by federal law. Hamburg schools might emphasize different aspects of resistance movements compared to Saxon curricula, but all students access the same core historical archives and educational resources. The psychological impact of these intensive educational experiences demanded new support systems that didn't exist in traditional classrooms. Every school now employs counselors specifically trained in trauma-informed education who work with students processing difficult historical content. The counselors don't just provide support after problematic reactions. They're integrated into the curriculum, helping students develop emotional resilience before engaging with particularly disturbing material. Some sessions include breathing exercises and mindfulness techniques that help students manage anxiety while viewing footage of liberation camps or listening to survivor testimonies. International classroom connections have transformed how German students understand their country's role in global history. Through live video links, students in German schools regularly discuss World War II with peers in Israel, Poland, and the United States. These conversations reveal how different educational systems approach the same historical events, often creating moments of recognition when German students realize their curriculum includes details that other countries minimize or omit entirely. The exchanges also work in reverse. American students are often surprised to learn how comprehensively German schools address topics like the Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe, which receives minimal attention in many U.S. curricula. The technology-focused approach has created significant pushback from educators who worry that immersive experiences replace critical thinking with emotional manipulation. These critics argue that virtual reality creates false intimacy with historical events, making students feel they've experienced something they cannot truly understand. They contend that analyzing primary documents, constructing arguments from evidence, and engaging in historical debate develops stronger analytical skills than passive consumption of digital content. The debate reflects broader tensions in education about whether emotional engagement or intellectual rigor should take priority in historical instruction. Holocaust denial debunking exercises represent another mandatory component that previous generations of German students never encountered. These modules teach students to identify and counter denial arguments using forensic evidence, demographic data, and documentary sources. Students learn to recognize common denial tactics like statistical manipulation, source misrepresentation, and logical fallacies. The exercises extend beyond Holocaust denial to include other forms of historical negationism, teaching students to evaluate claims about Armenian genocide, Rwandan genocide, and other mass atrocities. The goal is creating citizens who can resist manipulation of historical facts, regardless of the specific event being distorted. Germany's digital approach has influenced international educational standards in ways that extend far beyond national borders. The country now leads UNESCO working groups on historical education technology and hosts annual conferences where educators from around the world study German methods. Countries like France and Belgium have adopted modified versions of German VR programs, while nations with more sensitive historical relationships like Turkey and Armenia have expressed interest in neutral platforms for teaching contested events. The German model demonstrates how advanced technology can address historical education challenges that traditional methods struggled to resolve. The psychological impact of these educational changes has produced measurable results that surprised even the program's designers. German students now score highest globally in historical empathy assessments, which measure ability to understand multiple perspectives on historical events and recognize the human cost of political decisions. The assessments don't just measure knowledge of facts. They evaluate students' capacity to connect historical events to contemporary ethical questions and their willingness to engage with uncomfortable truths about their own society. These empathy scores correlate with other changes in student attitudes that extend beyond the classroom. German students show increased interest in international relations, higher rates of participation in cultural exchange programs, and greater support for policies that address contemporary human rights violations. The connection between historical education and civic engagement appears stronger than educators anticipated, suggesting that immersive learning experiences create lasting changes in how students view their responsibilities as citizens. The long-term implications of Germany's educational transformation remain unclear, but early indicators suggest fundamental changes in how an entire generation understands their country's past and their own role in preventing future atrocities. The approach has moved beyond simply teaching facts about World War II to creating citizens who view historical awareness as an active responsibility rather than passive knowledge. Yet, Germany's comprehensive approach to confronting its wartime past stands in stark contrast to how other nations handle similar historical reckonings. Japan's surprising curriculum transformation. Japan's educational transformation has followed a markedly different trajectory. The 2025 editions of Japanese history textbooks now dedicate significantly more space to wartime events, though this expansion comes from an extremely limited baseline. Previous textbooks covered the entire period from 1931 to 1945 in just 19 pages out of 357 total pages, with the Nanjing Massacre often reduced to a single sentence. This minimal coverage reflected decades of political pressure that began during the Cold War, when authorities banned textbooks that mentioned Japanese atrocities in detail. Students now encountered detailed accounts of the Nanjing Massacre that span multiple pages rather than single paragraphs. The Comfort Women system receives comprehensive coverage that includes survivor testimonies and documentary evidence, though textbooks avoid specific numerical estimates given the contested nature of casualty figures. Unit 731's biological warfare experiments are presented with specificity that previous generations of students never encountered, marking a dramatic departure from the brief mentions that characterized earlier educational materials. The political forces that created this transformation developed gradually over several decades rather than emerging from a single diplomatic crisis. International pressure came through educational exchange programs that highlighted disparities between Japanese textbook coverage and international historical consensus. Domestic pressure came from an unexpected source: Japanese millennials who had encountered comprehensive wartime history through international media and social platforms. These young adults, now parents themselves, demanded that their children receive the same detailed historical education available in other developed nations. The Liberal Democratic Party initially resisted these changes, but reversed course when polling showed that 73% of voters under 40 supported expanded wartime curriculum. Unit 731 now receives treatment that matches its historical significance rather than the brief mentions that characterize previous textbooks. Students learn specific details about the facility's location in Harbin, the scope of experiments conducted on Chinese and Soviet prisoners, and the post-war immunity deals that protected perpetrators from prosecution. The curriculum includes primary source documents from American military intelligence that detail the unit's activities. Photographs from the facility appear alongside survivor accounts that describe medical procedures conducted without anesthesia. The textbooks explain how Unit 731's research contributed to American biological weapons programs after the war, connecting historical events to broader questions about justice and accountability. The Comfort Women system receives similarly comprehensive treatment that acknowledges the experiences of women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories. New textbooks include maps showing the locations of comfort stations across the Japanese Empire. Students encounter personal testimonies from survivors whose accounts provide detailed descriptions of recruitment methods, living conditions, and long-term physical and psychological trauma. The curriculum addresses the systematic nature of the program while acknowledging ongoing scholarly debates about specific details and numbers. Survivor advocacy efforts reached a critical juncture as the remaining witnesses to Japanese wartime actions entered their final years. Organizations intensified their documentation efforts, creating video testimonies specifically designed for educational use. Japanese survivors of wartime policies also contributed to curriculum changes. Families affected by wartime food shortages, bombing campaigns, and military conscription pushed for textbooks that presented Japanese civilians as victims of their own government's decisions rather than passive recipients of Allied aggression. These domestic survivor voices helped create political space for acknowledging harm inflicted on other populations. Nationalist groups responded to curriculum changes with organized resistance that created significant challenges for schools and educators. The Japan Conference, which includes prominent politicians and business leaders, launched campaigns demanding that textbooks emphasize Japanese suffering rather than actions taken by Japanese forces. Local school boards faced pressure to adopt alternative textbooks that minimized coverage of wartime atrocities. Some nationalist organizations organized protests outside schools that implemented the new curriculum. The controversy intensified when several prefectural governors publicly criticized the Ministry of Education's textbook approval process. Teacher training programs underwent complete restructuring to prepare educators for classroom discussions about sensitive historical topics. The Ministry of Education established specialized institutes that focus specifically on wartime history pedagogy. Teachers participate in week-long intensive programs that cover historical content, classroom management techniques for controversial topics, and methods for addressing student emotional responses to difficult material. Training includes role-playing exercises where teachers practice responding to challenging questions from students or parents. The National Institute for Educational Policy Research now provides AI-supplemented lesson materials that help teachers navigate discussions about comfort women and other sensitive topics with age-appropriate content. Implementation varies dramatically across Japan's 47 prefectures, creating inconsistencies that reflect regional political climates and administrative priorities. Tokyo and Osaka moved quickly to adopt expanded wartime curriculum, while rural prefectures proceeded more cautiously. Some areas emphasized Japanese civilian suffering alongside acknowledgement of atrocities committed by Japanese forces. Others focused primarily on international perspectives and comparative approaches to wartime education. These variations created situations where students moving between prefectures encounter different levels of historical detail depending on their location. Relations between Japan and South Korea have improved measurably as educational approaches become more aligned. South Korean textbooks have historically provided comprehensive coverage of Japanese wartime actions, creating diplomatic tensions when Japanese education minimized the same events. The convergence of educational narratives has facilitated productive discussions about shared historical experiences and collaborative approaches to regional security challenges. Educational exchanges between Japanese and Korean schools have increased, with students from both countries participating in joint historical research projects. The generational divide within Japan regarding historical education reflects broader cultural shifts that extend beyond educational policy. Older Japanese citizens often express concern that expanded wartime curriculum undermines national pride and creates unnecessary guilt among young people. Younger Japanese show different priorities, viewing comprehensive historical education as necessary for informed citizenship and international credibility. This generational split appears in family discussions, workplace conversations, and political preferences. The statistic that 73% of Japanese students support comprehensive wartime education represents a fundamental shift in how young people view their country's historical responsibilities. Students report feeling more prepared for international interactions when they possess detailed knowledge of historical events that affect regional relationships. Many express relief that their education now matches international standards rather than creating knowledge gaps that emerge in global contexts. This transformation in Japanese historical education reflects broader global trends toward more comprehensive approaches to teaching difficult histories, though each nation's specific methods reveal distinct cultural and political priorities. How Arab nations are reframing Crusades education. Arab nations have approached their own historical reckonings through systematic restructuring of Crusades education, revealing how medieval conflicts continue to shape contemporary classroom discussions. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Education made an announcement in early 2025 that shocked educators across the Middle East. For the first time in the kingdom's modern history, high school textbooks would include European perspectives on the Crusades alongside traditional Islamic narratives. The new curriculum presents Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade not simply as religious aggression, but as a response to Byzantine requests for military assistance against Seljuk expansion. Students now read excerpts from medieval European chronicles that describe Crusader motivations in terms of pilgrimage, salvation, and economic opportunity, rather than solely through the lens of territorial conquest. This shift represents part of a broader transformation happening across Arab educational systems. Jordan updated its curriculum in late 2024 to include Western scholarly interpretations of Crusader military tactics and siege warfare techniques. Egypt's textbooks now acknowledge that some Crusader states maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring Muslim territories for decades. Morocco's educational ministry has introduced modules that examine how Crusader interactions with Iberian Muslim kingdoms influenced both Christian and Islamic military innovations. The changes reflect growing recognition that traditional narratives often simplified complex medieval realities. Modern geopolitical tensions continue to shape how these medieval conflicts appear in contemporary classrooms. The ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict creates particular sensitivity around how Crusader occupation of Jerusalem gets presented to students. Syrian textbooks emphasize parallels between medieval Frankish settlements and modern Israeli colonies in the West Bank. Lebanese educators navigate between Sunni and Shia perspectives on how Crusader presence affected different Islamic communities. Iraqi curriculum developers face pressure to connect Crusader invasions with more recent Western military interventions in the region. These contemporary influences mean that medieval history serves ongoing political purposes rather than remaining confined to historical analysis. The new emphasis on cultural exchange and scientific advancement during the Crusades period has transformed how students understand this era. Rather than focusing exclusively on military campaigns and religious warfare, curricula now highlight the translation movement that brought Greek philosophical texts from Arabic into Latin through Crusader territories. Students learn about the medical knowledge that European Crusaders acquired from Islamic physicians in places like Antioch and Edessa. The textbooks describe how Crusader architects incorporated Islamic geometric patterns and engineering techniques into their fortress construction. Agricultural innovations moved in both directions, with European crops being introduced to the Levant while Middle Eastern irrigation methods influenced European farming. Practices. Different Arab countries approach these historical events with perspectives that reflect their unique regional experiences and political priorities. Saudi Arabia emphasizes the role of the Hijaz region in providing logistical support for Muslim resistance efforts. Egyptian textbooks focus heavily on Saladin's Kurdish origins and his unification of Egypt and Syria against Crusader forces. Palestinian curricula highlight the destruction of local Christian and Muslim communities during Crusader conquests. Lebanese education presents the Crusades as part of the country's complex multi-religious heritage, acknowledging both Christian participation in Crusader armies and Muslim resistance movements. International educational partnerships have influenced curriculum development in ways that extend beyond traditional diplomatic relationships. The British Council has facilitated exchanges between Arab educators and medieval historians at universities like Oxford and Cambridge. These collaborations have introduced Arab curriculum developers to European primary source materials that were previously unavailable in Arabic translation. UNESCO's World Heritage programs have connected Arab educators with archaeological research on Crusader sites, providing new physical evidence about daily life in medieval settlements. The inclusion of Western scholarly sources has generated significant controversy among educators and religious authorities. Conservative voices argue that incorporating European perspectives legitimizes colonial interpretations of Islamic history. They contend that Western scholarship often minimizes the religious significance of Crusader actions while overemphasizing economic and political motivations. Progressive educators respond that excluding Western sources creates incomplete historical understanding and fails to prepare students for international academic environments. Some schools have resolved these tensions by requiring students to analyze both Western and Arab sources critically, identifying potential biases in each perspective. Teachers navigate between traditional narratives and new educational approaches through careful classroom management and curriculum design. Veteran educators who were trained to present Crusades as straightforward Islamic resistance against Christian aggression now must incorporate more complex interpretations that acknowledge internal Muslim divisions and Crusader Muslim cooperation. Professional development programs have emerged to help teachers handle student questions about apparent contradictions between old and new historical accounts. Student reactions to these more complex historical presentations vary significantly across different educational contexts and family backgrounds. Urban students with access to international media often embrace nuanced interpretations that match what they encounter online. Rural students sometimes resist narratives that challenge traditional stories they learn from family members or religious instruction. Many students express confusion about why their textbooks now include information that contradicts what their parents learned in school. The unexpected connections students are making between medieval and modern conflicts have surprised educators and curriculum developers. Students frequently ask whether contemporary Western military presence in the Middle East represents a continuation of Crusader objectives. They draw parallels between medieval Frankish settlements and modern Israeli colonies, noting similarities in demographic strategies and territorial control methods. Some students connect Crusader military orders like the Knights Templar with modern private military contractors operating in the region. These educational transformations across Arab nations demonstrate how historical instruction adapts to contemporary political realities while attempting to maintain scholarly integrity. The medieval period has become a lens through which students analyze contemporary geopolitical relationships rather than simply a historical curiosity. As these curriculum changes take hold across the Middle East, they join a global pattern of nations wrestling with how to present difficult histories to new generations. The challenge of balancing historical accuracy with national narratives has become a defining educational issue that extends far beyond the Arab world, affecting how Britain's uncomfortable reckoning with empire. Britain confronts this challenge through mandatory colonial education that became law in January 2025. The Department for Education directive requires every state school in England to include modules on colonial atrocities within their history curriculum. The mandate covers the Bengal famine of 1943, the Amritsar massacre the concentration camps used during the Boer War, and the systematic exploitation of resources across the British Empire. This represents the first time that British schools have been required by law to teach about the darker aspects of imperial history rather than simply mentioning them in passing or omitting them entirely. The political battle that produced this educational overhaul began in 2021 when the Black Lives Matter protests forced uncomfortable conversations about Britain's colonial legacy. Labour MP David Lammy introduced the first bill requiring comprehensive colonial education in 2022, but it faced fierce resistance from conservative MPs who argued it would undermine British identity and national pride. The breakthrough came when several high-profile conservative politicians, including former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, publicly supported expanded historical education after their own children asked why British textbooks differed so dramatically from international sources they encountered online. The decisive moment occurred when polling showed that 67% of parents wanted schools to teach complete rather than selective versions of British history. England's implementation focuses heavily on economic exploitation and systematic violence across the empire. Students now learn specific details about how British companies extracted wealth from colonial territories while local populations face poverty and starvation. The curriculum includes primary source documents from colonial administrators describing deliberate policies that prioritized resource extraction over local welfare. Teachers present data showing how British industrial development depended on raw materials obtained through forced labor and below-market pricing schemes. Students examine maps tracking the flow of goods from colonies to Britain alongside population data, showing mortality rates in territories under British control. Scotland's approach differs dramatically from England's implementation, reflecting the country's complex relationship with both British imperialism and its own colonial participation. Scottish schools emphasize how Highland clearances and English suppression of Scottish culture created parallels with colonial experiences elsewhere. The curriculum acknowledges Scottish participation in imperial ventures while also highlighting how Scotland itself experienced forms of internal colonization. Students learn about Scottish regiments' roles in colonial conflicts alongside discussions of how economic pressures drove Scottish emigration to colonial territories. Wales has developed its own distinct approach that connects imperial history with Welsh experiences of cultural and linguistic suppression. Welsh schools teach about the role of Welsh missionaries and administrators in colonial territories while examining how English policies attempted to eliminate Welsh language and culture. Students learn about Welsh participation in colonial military campaigns alongside discussions of how industrial development in Wales depended on imperial resources. The curriculum includes modules on how coal mining in Wales connected to imperial trade networks, while also acknowledging the environmental and social costs of industrial development. Northern Ireland's implementation navigates particularly sensitive territory, given the region's own colonial history and ongoing political divisions. Schools present imperial history through frameworks that acknowledge different community perspectives on British rule and resistance movements. Students learn about Irish participation in imperial ventures alongside discussions of how colonial policies developed in Ireland were later applied in other territories. The curriculum includes comparative analysis of resistance movements across the empire while avoiding direct parallels that might inflame local political tensions. Teacher preparation for these previously avoided topics has required extensive professional development programs that many educators find challenging and emotionally difficult. The government established regional training centers where teachers participate in week-long intensive courses covering colonial history, primary source analysis, and classroom management techniques for controversial topics. Training includes sessions on how to present violent historical content appropriately for different age groups, and how to respond to student questions about moral responsibility and historical guilt. Teachers learn to distinguish between historical facts and moral judgments, allowing them to present information objectively, while encouraging critical thinking about cause and effect relationships. Parent and community reactions have created significant challenges for schools implementing the new curriculum. Some parents argue that focusing on colonial atrocities creates excessive guilt among British children and undermines their sense of national identity. Others contend that the curriculum finally provides their children with historical knowledge that matches what they encounter in international contexts. Schools have organized information sessions where parents can review curriculum materials and ask questions about educational objectives. These sessions often reveal generational differences in historical knowledge, with many parents learning about colonial events for the first time alongside their children. The connection between historical education and contemporary immigration debates has become apparent as students encounter more comprehensive accounts of how colonial policies affected global population movements. Students learn about how economic disruption in colonial territories created conditions that continue to influence migration patterns today. The curriculum includes discussions of how colonial borders drawn without regard for ethnic or cultural boundaries created ongoing conflicts that generate refugee populations. Former colonies have responded to Britain's educational changes with cautious optimism mixed with skepticism about whether the reforms represent genuine acknowledgement or superficial gestures. Indian educational officials have praised the inclusion of Bengal famine material, while noting that British curriculum still omits many other colonial atrocities. Kenyan educators have welcomed recognition of concentration camp policies, while pointing out that the curriculum fails to address the full scope of colonial violence. The generational divide in attitudes toward the empire has become stark as educational changes take effect. 60% of British students now view the empire more critically than their parents, representing a fundamental shift in how young people understand their country's historical role. Students express surprise at learning about events that their parents and grandparents never encountered in school. Many report feeling better prepared for international interactions when they possess knowledge of colonial history that affects relationships with other countries. These educational transformations across Western nations reveal how contemporary politics shapes historical instruction, but some countries face even more complex challenges when ancient civilizations intersect with modern ideological requirements. Persia's ancient pride meets modern Iran. Iran demonstrates this complexity through educational policies that celebrate ancient Persian achievements while maintaining Islamic revolutionary orthodoxy. Teachers must present Cyrus the Great as a model of just leadership, while ensuring that students understand his accomplishments never overshadow the spiritual authority of Islamic teachings. The curriculum describes Cyrus as a divinely guided ruler whose policies of religious tolerance and human rights laid groundwork for later Islamic principles of justice. Students learn about the Cyrus Cylinder and its Declaration of Human Rights, but teachers carefully frame these achievements as precursors to Islamic revelation rather than independent moral discoveries. The balancing act requires constant attention to language and emphasis, ensuring that pre-Islamic Persian accomplishments support rather than compete with Islamic revolutionary values. The celebration of Cyrus presents particular complications when students encounter his policies on religious freedom and cultural diversity. The ancient Persian emperor's approach to governing conquered peoples emphasized tolerance and local autonomy, principles that align with certain Islamic teachings but sometimes conflict with contemporary Iranian religious orthodoxy. Teachers navigate this tension by emphasizing how Cyrus prepared the world for Islamic revelation through his just governance. They present his respect for local customs and religions as evidence of divine preparation for the universal message of Islam. Students learn that Cyrus succeeded not despite his tolerance, but because he followed divine guidance that would later be perfected through Islamic teachings. Alexander the Great receives treatment that reflects Iran's complex relationship with foreign conquest and cultural preservation. Iranian textbooks present Alexander as both destroyer of the Achaemenid Empire and inadvertent preserver of Persian culture through Hellenistic kingdoms that maintain Persian administrative systems and artistic traditions. Students learn how Alexander's conquest devastated Persian political structures while simultaneously spreading Persian cultural influence across his vast empire. The curriculum emphasizes how Persian architectural styles, artistic motifs, and governmental practices influenced Hellenistic civilization long after the Achaemenid dynasty ended. Teachers explain how Persian cultural elements survived Alexander's military destruction through adaptation and integration with Greek traditions. This dual portrayal extends to discussions of how Alexander's conquests affected Persian intellectual traditions. Students discover that Persian libraries and educational institutions were destroyed during the conquest, but Persian scholars continued their work within Hellenistic kingdoms. The curriculum describes how Persian astronomical knowledge, mathematical concepts, and philosophical ideas influenced Greek thinkers who had previously dismissed Persian intellectual achievements. Teachers present this cultural exchange as evidence that truth and wisdom can survive political destruction, a lesson that resonates with contemporary Iranian experiences of international isolation and pressure. Archaeological discoveries from sites like Persepolis and Susa now receive detailed coverage that was previously impossible due to limited excavation and research funding. Recent findings have revealed new information about daily life in ancient Persian cities, including evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced engineering techniques, and complex trade networks that connected Iran with civilizations across Asia and Europe. Students examine pottery fragments, architectural remains, and written documents that provide concrete evidence about Persian achievements. These archaeological materials help students understand that Persian civilization was not simply a political empire but a sophisticated cultural system that influenced human development across continents. Regional variations in historical emphasis reflect Iran's ethnic and cultural diversity. Kurdish regions focus heavily on Persian policies toward ethnic minorities and the administrative autonomy that characterized the Achaemenid system. Arab-majority areas in Kazakhstan emphasize how Persian tolerance for local cultures provided models for later Islamic governance. Azerbaijani regions highlight connections between ancient Persian and Turkic cultural traditions. Baluk areas emphasize how Persian administrative systems accommodated nomadic lifestyles and tribal governance structures. These regional curricula help students understand that Persian civilization encompassed diverse peoples and cultures rather than imposing uniform practices across the empire. International sanctions have created significant obstacles for Iranian educators seeking access to global historical scholarship and archaeological research. Iranian universities cannot easily obtain international academic publications or participate in collaborative research projects that would enhance understanding of Persian history within global contexts. This isolation has forced Iranian scholars to rely primarily on domestic research and archaeological work, limiting exposure to comparative historical analysis and international scholarly debates about Persian civilization. The sanctions have also affected access to digital resources and online databases that would allow Iranian students to examine Persian artifacts housed in foreign museums. Young Iranians increasingly connect ancient Persian values with contemporary identity in ways that transcend political and religious boundaries. Students identify with Cyrus's emphasis on justice and tolerance as principles that could guide modern Iranian society toward greater freedom and prosperity. They find inspiration in Persian architectural achievements and artistic traditions that demonstrate their ancestors' creativity and technical sophistication. These connections help young people maintain pride in Iranian heritage while navigating contemporary challenges and restrictions. Diaspora Iranian communities contribute to homeland educational perspectives through online resources, alternative historical narratives, and educational materials that circulate through informal networks. Iranian families living abroad share textbooks, documentary films, and historical interpretations that provide different perspectives on Persian history. These materials often emphasize Persian achievements and cultural contributions without the ideological constraints that shape domestic Iranian curriculum. Persian language historical texts have experienced remarkable revival within modern curriculum as educators recognize the importance of accessing primary sources in their original language. Students now encounter medieval Persian historical works, poetry, and philosophical treatises that were previously considered too difficult or ideologically problematic for classroom use. This renaissance of Persian literary heritage provides students with direct access to their intellectual traditions and helps them develop sophisticated understanding of Persian cultural achievements that extends beyond political narratives. About empire and conquest, these transformations in historical education across different nations reveal how technology and digital resources are reshaping classroom experiences in ways that would have been impossible just a few years ago. The technology revolution in historical education. Digital simulations now appear in 85% of history classrooms worldwide, marking the most significant educational transformation since the introduction of printed textbooks. These simulations range from simple timeline interactions to complex role-playing scenarios where students make decisions as historical figures and witness the consequences of their choices. In Finland, students navigate medieval trade routes while managing resources and negotiating with different kingdoms. Brazilian classrooms use simulations that recreate the economic conditions leading to the abolition of slavery, forcing students to understand the complex financial and social factors that influence policy decisions. The widespread adoption occurred rapidly between 2023 and 2025 as schools discovered that digital tools could address engagement problems that traditional methods struggled to solve. Artificial intelligence has created personalized learning experiences that adapt to individual student needs in ways that human teachers cannot match across large classroom sizes. AI systems analyze how quickly students process information, which types of examples help them understand concepts, and what knowledge gaps require additional attention. A student struggling with causation in historical events receives different content than one who excels at memorizing dates, but struggles with analysis. The AI generates custom quizzes, suggests relevant primary sources, and creates practice exercises that target specific learning objectives. Students in rural Montana access the same quality of personalized instruction as those in well-funded urban districts, addressing educational inequities that have persisted for decades. Virtual reality field trips have transformed how students experience historical sites and events that would be impossible to visit in person. Students in landlocked countries now walk through ancient Pompeii, observing daily life before the volcanic eruption. They stand in the trenches of World War I battlefields, experiencing the confined spaces and difficult conditions that shaped soldier experiences. VR technology allows students to witness historical events from multiple perspectives, watching the same battle from different vantage points or experiencing the same political crisis through the eyes of various social classes. The technology has become sophisticated enough that students can examine architectural details, read inscriptions on monuments, and interact with historically accurate recreations of daily life in different time periods. Blockchain technology addresses growing concerns about source authenticity and digital manipulation in historical education. Teachers upload primary source documents to blockchain networks that create permanent, unalterable records of their provenance and authenticity. Students learn to verify document chains that trace sources from original archives through various digitization processes. The technology helps educators combat the spread of fabricated historical documents that circulate online and teaches students to distinguish between verified and unverified sources. Universities collaborate with archives to create blockchain-verified collections of historical documents that schools can access with confidence about their authenticity. The global divide between tech-enabled and traditional educational approaches has created stark inequalities in historical education quality. Schools in developed countries integrate AI tutors, VR experiences, and interactive simulations, while institutions in developing regions continue to rely on outdated textbooks and lecture-based instruction. This disparity affects not only student engagement, but also their preparation for higher education and international academic environments. Students from tech-enabled schools demonstrate superior critical thinking skills and historical analysis abilities compared to those from traditional educational settings. The gap has widened as technology costs decrease in wealthy regions while remaining prohibitive in areas with limited educational budgets. Social media platforms have become integrated into historical research projects in ways that blur the boundaries between formal and informal learning. Students create TikTok videos explaining historical events, reaching audiences beyond their classrooms while developing communication skills. Instagram accounts dedicated to historical analysis attract millions of followers who engage with complex historical content through visual storytelling. Twitter threads dissect primary sources and historical interpretations, creating real-time scholarly discussions that students can observe and join. Teachers assign research projects that require students to fact-check historical claims circulating on social media, developing digital literacy skills alongside historical knowledge. Digital manipulation concerns have intensified as deepfake technology and AI-generated content become more sophisticated and accessible. Students encounter fabricated historical footage, manipulated photographs, and artificially generated documents that appear authentic to casual observation. Educators struggle to teach source verification skills that keep pace with rapidly evolving manipulation techniques. The concern extends beyond obvious falsifications to subtle alterations that change historical narratives without completely fabricating evidence. Teachers spend increasing amounts of time teaching students to identify manipulation techniques rather than focusing on historical content and analysis. Teachers adapt to rapidly changing technological tools through professional development programs that cannot keep pace with innovation speed. Educators learn to use AI platforms only to discover that newer versions have different interfaces and capabilities. Virtual reality software updates change how students interact with historical simulations, requiring teachers to relearn classroom management techniques for immersive experiences. Many teachers report feeling overwhelmed by the constant need to master new technologies while maintaining expertise in historical content. The breakthrough finding that immersive technology increases historical retention by 340% has revolutionized educational research and funding priorities. Students who experience historical events through virtual reality remember details and concepts months later at rates that traditional instruction cannot match. The retention improvement applies not only to factual information, but also to analytical skills and historical thinking processes. Students who participate in historical simulations demonstrate better understanding of cause and effect relationships and multiple perspective analysis. These technological advances have created fundamental questions about the purpose and methods of historical education, while simultaneously making historical curricula more visible to public scrutiny than ever before. Digital platforms allow parents, politicians, and advocacy groups to monitor classroom content in real time, creating new pressures on educators who must balance technological innovation with increasingly politicized expectations. The battle between national pride and historical truth. These pressures have created an unprecedented global crisis where historical accuracy increasingly competes with political objectives in classroom instruction. A comprehensive global survey released in 2025 reveals that 70% of countries worldwide now experience significant political pressure regarding their historical curricula. This represents a dramatic increase from previous decades when educational content remained largely within academic circles. The pressure manifests through government officials demanding curriculum changes, political parties campaigning on educational platforms, and civil society groups organizing protests over textbook content. Countries across every continent report similar patterns where historical education has become a contested political issue rather than a purely academic concern. The survey documented cases from democratic nations like the United States and India alongside authoritarian regimes in China and Russia, suggesting that political interference in historical education transcends political systems. Authoritarian governments have developed sophisticated strategies for controlling historical narratives that extend far beyond simple censorship. These regimes employ teams of historians to create state-approved versions of controversial events while simultaneously restricting access to alternative sources and international scholarship. Government officials monitor classroom discussions through informant networks and digital surveillance systems that track what teachers actually present to students. The control mechanisms include mandatory teacher training programs that emphasize ideologically acceptable interpretations of historical events. Publishers face licensing requirements that effectively give governments veto power over textbook content. Universities that train history teachers receive funding contingent on their curriculum aligning with state priorities. The result is educational systems that present carefully curated versions of the past designed to support current political objectives. International educational monitoring organizations have emerged as crucial watchdogs in this environment of increasing political manipulation. UNESCO has expanded its educational oversight role to include regular assessments of curriculum integrity across member nations. The International Association of History Teachers now publishes annual reports documenting cases of political interference in historical education. Regional organizations like the European Council have established committees specifically focused on protecting academic freedom in schools. These monitoring bodies conduct independent audits of textbooks, interview teachers confidentially, and publish detailed reports about government manipulation of historical content. Their findings carry diplomatic weight as countries face international pressure when documented cases of educational manipulation become public. Specific instances of political interference have become increasingly bold and direct. In one documented case, a government ordered the immediate removal of all references to a controversial historical event from textbooks already distributed to schools. Teachers received written instructions to skip certain chapters while new editions were prepared with sanitized content. Another country mandated that all history teachers attend re-education seminars before discussing particular time periods with students. Publishers have reported receiving lists of forbidden topics and required interpretations that must appear in future textbook editions. Some governments have created parallel textbook approval processes that bypass traditional academic review in favor of political evaluation. These interventions often occur with little public notice, making it difficult for educators and parents to track how curriculum content changes over time. Social media platforms have transformed how controversies over historical teaching develop and spread. Parents now photograph textbook pages and share them online, creating viral debates about educational content. Teachers use private social media groups to warn colleagues about political pressure and share strategies for handling sensitive topics. Students post videos of classroom discussions that contradict official narratives, sometimes leading to teacher discipline or curriculum changes. Misinformation about historical events spreads rapidly through social networks, creating confusion about facts versus political interpretation. Government officials monitor social media for criticism of approved historical narratives and sometimes take action against teachers or schools that receive negative attention. International courts have begun hearing cases related to educational freedom as teachers and advocacy groups challenge government control over historical curriculum. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled on several cases involving teachers who faced discipline for presenting alternative historical perspectives. International arbitration panels have addressed disputes between countries over textbook content that affects diplomatic relationships. These legal challenges often center on whether governments can restrict academic freedom in the name of national security or social stability. Court decisions have established precedents that protect teachers' rights to present factual information even when it contradicts official narratives. Teachers worldwide have organized professional networks dedicated to protecting academic integrity in historical education. These organizations provide legal support for educators facing political pressure and create resources for teaching controversial topics without violating government restrictions. Teacher unions have adopted specific policies defending members' rights to present factual historical information regardless of political implications. Professional associations publish guidelines for maintaining educational standards while navigating political pressures. International teacher exchange programs now include training on how to handle politically sensitive historical content. Political polarization has created classroom environments where historical discussions become contentious debates that mirror broader social divisions. Teachers report that students arrive in class with strong political opinions about historical events that they learn from family members or social media rather than academic sources. Some teachers have stopped teaching certain historical topics entirely to avoid controversy, while others have developed elaborate strategies for presenting multiple perspectives without appearing to favor any particular interpretation. Students increasingly use global resources to fact-check their own curriculum, creating situations where they know more about certain historical events than their textbooks acknowledge. Online databases and international educational websites provide access to primary sources and scholarly research that may contradict locally approved narratives. Students use translation software to access foreign language sources about historical events, sometimes discovering significant discrepancies with their domestic curriculum. The trend of historical education becoming a political battleground in democracies represents a concerning development that affects countries previously considered immune to such manipulation. Democratic governments face pressure from competing political factions that want historical curriculum to support their respective ideologies. Election campaigns increasingly feature promises to change how history is taught in schools, treating educational content as a political issue rather than an academic one. This politicization threatens the fundamental principle that historical education should be based on evidence and scholarly consensus rather than political popularity or ideological preferences. These battles over historical truth have created measurable consequences for student learning that extend far beyond classroom politics. Student Knowledge Crisis, the 2025 Global Assessment. The 2025 International Assessment of Historical Literacy produced results that shocked educators worldwide. 40% of students globally cannot identify major 20th century events including World War II, the Cold War, or the fall of the Berlin Wall. The assessment tested over 500,000 students across 85 countries using standardized questions about fundamental historical knowledge that previous generations considered basic educational requirements. Students struggled particularly with chronology, unable to place major events in proper historical sequence or understand cause and effect relationships between different historical periods. The assessment revealed that many students possess fragmented historical knowledge without coherent understanding of how events connect across time and geography. The comprehensive study examined historical literacy through multiple evaluation methods, including written tests, oral interviews, and practical exercises requiring students to analyze primary source documents. Researchers tested factual knowledge alongside analytical skills, measuring whether students could identify historical events and understand their significance within broader historical contexts. The assessment covered ancient civilizations, medieval periods, early modern developments, and contemporary history with particular emphasis on events that shaped the modern world. Students faced questions about political systems, economic developments, social movements, and cultural changes that influenced human societies across different continents and time periods. Educational systems demonstrated remarkable variations in historical literacy levels that challenged conventional assumptions about academic achievement. Singapore topped the rankings, with 89% of students demonstrating comprehensive historical knowledge, followed unexpectedly by Rwanda at 84% and Estonia at 82%. These results surprised researchers who anticipated that wealthy Western nations would dominate the upper rankings. The United States ranked 31st, with only 61% of students meeting basic historical literacy standards, while the United Kingdom placed 28th at 63%. France performed better at 19th place with 71% student proficiency, but still lagged behind countries with smaller educational budgets and less international recognition for academic excellence. The bottom rankings revealed countries struggling with fundamental educational infrastructure and political instability. Chad, Afghanistan, and Somalia recorded the lowest historical literacy rates, with fewer than 25% of students demonstrating basic historical knowledge. However, some surprising entries appeared near the bottom of the rankings, including certain wealthy nations that devoted substantial resources to education. These unexpected results prompted researchers to examine factors beyond simple economic indicators that influence historical learning outcomes. The correlation between educational spending and historical literacy proved weaker than researchers anticipated. Countries spending over $15,000 per student annually did not consistently outperform nations with budgets below $3,000 per student. Rwanda's high performance occurred despite spending only $280 per student on education, while some European countries with budgets exceeding $12,000 per student produced mediocre results. The data suggests that spending efficiency and curriculum design matter more than absolute budget levels. Countries that invested specifically in history teacher training, primary source materials, and interactive learning technologies achieved better outcomes than those that spread educational resources across multiple subjects without targeted historical education initiatives. Social media consumption patterns showed complex relationships with historical knowledge retention that varied significantly across different platforms and usage patterns. Students who spent over 4 hours daily on entertainment-focused social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram scored 23% lower on historical literacy assessments compared to peers with limited social media exposure. However, students who used social media platforms for educational purposes, including history-focused YouTube channels and documentary content, scored 18% higher than average. The quality of social media engagement mattered more than quantity, with students who actively participated in historical discussions online demonstrating superior analytical skills compared to passive consumers of historical content. Standardized testing systems produced contradictory effects on historical education quality that surprised researchers and educators. Countries with intensive standardized testing regimens often produced students who could memorize historical facts but struggled with analytical thinking and source evaluation. South Korea's students excelled at identifying dates and names, but performed poorly when asked to analyze historical causation or evaluate competing historical interpretations. Conversely, countries with less emphasis on standardized testing but more focus on project-based learning and primary source analysis produce students with stronger critical thinking skills despite lower factual recall scores. Cultural factors influence historical learning outcomes in ways that transcended simple East-West or developing nation divisions. Countries with strong oral history traditions often produce students who understood historical narratives and human experiences better than those from text-based educational cultures. Indigenous communities in Canada and Australia, despite facing significant educational disadvantages, demonstrated superior understanding of historical continuity and change compared to mainstream student populations. Students from cultures that emphasized family storytelling and intergenerational knowledge transfer showed stronger grasp of how historical events affected ordinary people's lives. The gap between urban and rural historical education has widened dramatically over the past decade, creating significant disparities within individual countries. Urban students consistently outperformed rural counterparts by margins ranging from 15% to 35% depending on the country and specific historical topics tested. Rural schools often lacked access to primary source materials, museum partnerships, and visiting historians that enhanced urban educational experiences. Internet connectivity problems in rural areas limited access to online historical resources and virtual museum tours that urban students used regularly. The most unexpected finding challenged conventional wisdom about teaching controversial historical topics. Countries that included difficult and controversial historical events in their mandatory curriculum achieved higher overall historical literacy rates than those that avoided sensitive subjects. Students in countries that taught about genocides, colonial atrocities, and authoritarian abuses scored 28% higher on comprehensive historical assessments compared to peers from nations that focused primarily on heroic narratives and national achievements. The research suggests that engaging with complex and morally challenging historical content develops critical thinking skills that transfer to other historical topics. This correlation held true across different political systems and cultural contexts. Democratic countries that taught about their own historical mistakes and authoritarian periods produced more historically literate students than democracies that emphasized only positive historical narratives. Similarly, post-conflict nations that incorporated honest examination of recent violence and reconciliation processes into their curricula achieved better educational outcomes than countries that avoided discussing recent traumatic events. The assessment results have prompted urgent discussions among international educational organizations about fundamental approaches to historical instruction. The findings suggest that current educational strategies fail to prepare students for citizenship in increasingly complex global societies where historical knowledge influences political decisions and international relationships. The crisis in historical literacy threatens democratic institutions that depend on informed citizens capable of learning from past experiences and understanding contemporary events within historical contexts. These educational deficiencies have already begun manifesting in real-world diplomatic tensions as students discover fundamental contradictions between what different nations teach about shared historical events. Recent controversies that shook global education. 3 major international incidents in 2025 transformed how the world views historical education as a diplomatic issue. The first crisis erupted when students discovered that textbooks in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh presented completely different accounts of the 1971 liberation war. Indian textbooks described Pakistani military actions as systematic genocide, while Pakistani curricula portrayed the conflict as Indian aggression disguised as humanitarian intervention. Bangladeshi textbooks emphasized their independence struggle while minimizing both Indian assistance and Pakistani grievances. The contradictions became public when exchange students posted side-by-side comparisons of their history books on social media platforms. Within days, the images went viral across South Asia, creating public outrage in all 3 countries as citizens realized how dramatically their educational systems distorted shared historical events. The incident escalated when Pakistani parents demanded explanations for why their children learned completely different facts about the same war as their Indian neighbors. Indian educators faced similar pressure as families questioned why textbooks omitted Pakistani perspectives on events that shaped regional relationships. Bangladeshi students organized protests demanding more comprehensive coverage that acknowledged complexities rather than simplified national narratives. The controversy spread beyond education when politicians began using the textbook disparities to justify their positions on contemporary diplomatic disputes. Media coverage intensified the crisis, as news outlets in each country highlighted the most extreme examples of historical distortion found in neighboring nations' curricula. UNESCO launched an unprecedented intervention in historical education disputes after the South Asian textbook Crises threatened to derail regional cooperation efforts. The organization established an independent commission comprising historians from neutral countries who reviewed curricula from all three nations involved in the controversy. The commission documented over 200 specific instances where textbooks presented factually incorrect information or omitted crucial context about shared historical events. UNESCO's investigation revealed that political pressure had forced publishers to alter historical accounts to match government preferences rather than scholarly consensus about documented events. The Commission published detailed recommendations requiring each country to acknowledge alternative perspectives on disputed events and include primary source materials that contradicted simplified national narratives. UNESCO threatened to suspend educational cooperation programs with countries that refused to implement the recommended changes. This marked the first time an international organization had formally intervened in national curriculum decisions based on concerns about historical accuracy rather than human rights violations or discriminatory content. Social media campaigns transformed from spontaneous student posts into organized international movements demanding educational reforms across multiple continents. The hashtag Movement for Historical Truth gained over 50 million interactions within 3 months as students shared examples of biased or incomplete historical education from their own countries. Turkish students posted about Ottoman Empire coverage, while Armenian diaspora communities highlighted genocide denial in Turkish textbooks. Japanese students shared examples of sanitized World War II narratives, while Korean activists documented comfort women denial in Japanese curricula. These campaigns succeeded in forcing curriculum changes through sustained pressure that governments could not ignore. The Turkish Ministry of Education announced revisions to Ottoman history coverage after sustained international attention to student complaints. Several European countries updated their colonial history curricula following campaigns by students from former colonies who documented how European textbooks minimized imperial violence. The campaigns demonstrated how digital activism could bypass traditional diplomatic channels and create direct pressure for educational accountability. Diplomatic relations suffered measurable damage as educational controversies spilled into broader international relationships. The India-Pakistan textbook dispute coincided with the breakdown of scheduled trade negotiations as both sides cited educational nationalism as evidence of bad faith in other diplomatic contexts. Bangladesh postponed cultural exchange programs with both neighbors until curriculum disputes were resolved. Similar patterns emerged elsewhere as countries used educational policies to justify broader diplomatic grievances or withdrew from cooperative agreements, citing concerns about historical misrepresentation. International student exchanges became catalysts for exposing educational disparities as young people directly confronted conflicting historical narratives during study abroad programs. American students studying in Vietnam encountered comprehensive coverage of Agent Orange and civilian casualties that their domestic education had minimized. European exchange students in former colonies learned about imperial violence that their home curricula had omitted or sanitized. These encounters created awkward situations as students questioned their host institutions about apparent discrepancies while simultaneously recognizing gaps in their own educational backgrounds. Cross-border educational litigation emerged as individuals and organizations filed lawsuits challenging biased curricula in international courts. The European Court of Human Rights heard cases involving teachers who faced discipline for presenting alternative historical perspectives that contradicted official narratives. Armenian organizations filed suits against Turkish educational institutions over genocide denial, while Turkish groups challenged Armenian historical claims in European courts. These legal challenges established precedents protecting academic freedom in historical education while recognizing limits on government control over curriculum content. Global corporations influenced historical education through strategic funding that shaped curriculum development in ways that often remained hidden from public scrutiny. Technology, companies provided educational software and digital resources that embedded particular historical interpretations within seemingly neutral learning platforms. Energy corporations funded educational programs about industrial development that minimized environmental costs and labor exploitation. Critics documented how corporate funding created conflicts of interest that compromised educational integrity as institutions faced pressure to present corporate-friendly historical narratives in exchange for continued financial support. Underground networks sharing alternative historical curricula developed sophisticated distribution systems that circumvented government restrictions and corporate influence. These networks operated through encrypted messaging platforms and secure file-sharing systems that protected educators and students from official retaliation. Teachers shared lesson plans, primary source materials, and educational resources that provided comprehensive coverage of topics their official curricula avoided or misrepresented. The networks included historians, educators, and activists who collaborated across national boundaries to create educational materials based on scholarly consensus rather than political preferences. The global student movement, demanding honest historical education, reached a watershed moment when coordinated protests occurred simultaneously across 6 continents. Students organized walkouts, social media campaigns, and petition drives demanding comprehensive coverage of controversial historical topics their curricula avoided or misrepresented. The movement demonstrated unprecedented international coordination as young people shared strategies and supported each other's educational reform efforts across national boundaries. These controversies have created momentum for fundamental changes in how historical education operates worldwide, with experts beginning to envision the future of teaching our troubled past. These reform movements have created momentum for fundamental changes that will reshape historical education within the next 5 years as technological integration reaches unprecedented levels across global school systems. The changes extend beyond simple digitization to fundamental alterations in how students engage with historical content and develop critical thinking skills. Traditional lecture-based approaches will become obsolete as interactive simulations and personalized learning platforms replace standardized curriculum delivery methods. This transformation affects not only classroom techniques, but also assessment strategies, teacher training requirements, and the basic objectives of historical education. Schools are already piloting programs that eliminate textbooks entirely in favor of dynamic digital resources that update automatically as new archaeological discoveries emerge or scholarly interpretations evolve. Educators worldwide have reached remarkable consensus about best practices for teaching controversial historical subjects despite previous decades of disagreement and national variations. The emerging framework emphasizes multiple perspective analysis rather than single narrative presentation, requiring students to examine historical events through various cultural, social, and political lenses. Teachers now integrate marginalized voices systematically rather than treating them as supplementary additions to mainstream historical accounts. This approach acknowledges that historical understanding develops through confronting complexity rather than simplifying events into easily digestible moral lessons. Professional development programs across continents now train educators to facilitate difficult conversations about genocide, slavery, colonialism, and other traumatic historical experiences without creating classroom environments that discourage open discussion or critical examination. Artificial intelligence applications in historical education show potential for eliminating human bias through systematic analysis of vast source collections and automated identification of perspective gaps in educational materials. AI systems can scan thousands of primary documents, archaeological findings, and scholarly publications to identify patterns of inclusion and exclusion that human curators might miss due to cultural assumptions or unconscious preferences. These technologies can generate balanced curriculum suggestions that incorporate diverse viewpoints while maintaining historical accuracy based on available evidence. Machine learning algorithms analyze student responses to identify areas where bias influences comprehension and recommend targeted interventions to address misconceptions or incomplete understanding. However, concerns persist about AI systems potentially amplifying existing biases present in their training data or being manipulated to support particular political interpretations of historical events. The movement toward global historical education standards represents unprecedented international cooperation in addressing educational disparities and political manipulation of historical curricula. UNESCO has established working groups comprising historians, educators, and policy experts from every continent to develop baseline requirements for historical literacy that transcend national boundaries. These standards focus on analytical skills rather than specific factual knowledge, emphasizing abilities to evaluate sources, understand causation, and recognize historical complexity. Implementation faces significant challenges from governments that view standardized international requirements as threats to national sovereignty or cultural identity. Despite these obstacles, 43 countries have committed to pilot programs that align their historical education with international standards. Climate change considerations now reshape historical education priorities as educators recognize connections between past environmental decisions and contemporary ecological challenges. New curricula examine how historical deforestation practices, industrial development patterns, and resource extraction methods created long-term environmental consequences that affect current climate patterns. Students analyze case studies showing how past societies responded to environmental changes, drawing lessons applicable to contemporary climate adaptation strategies. This environmental history integration extends beyond obvious connections to examine how climate factors influenced migration patterns, conflict development, and social structure changes throughout human history. The approach helps students understand current environmental challenges as parts of longer historical processes rather than isolated contemporary problems requiring entirely new solutions. Younger teachers entering educational systems demonstrate unprecedented commitment to honest historical instruction that acknowledges difficult aspects of national and cultural pasts. This generational shift reflects educators who received more comprehensive historical education themselves and possess greater comfort with addressing controversial topics in classroom settings. They advocate for curricula that examine historical injustices systematically rather than avoiding uncomfortable subjects that might challenge student assumptions or family beliefs. These educators push for professional autonomy that protects their ability to present evidence-based historical interpretations regardless of political pressure from administrators or community groups. Their influence grows as veteran teachers retire and educational institutions recognize that avoiding controversial history fails to prepare students for citizenship in diverse democratic societies. Virtual reality technology developments promise genuinely immersive historical experiences that allow students to explore recreated historical environments and witness significant events from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Advanced VR systems now provide haptic feedback that lets students feel textures of historical artifacts, experience physical conditions in different historical periods, and understand spatial relationships in historical settings. These technologies enable students to examine the same historical event from various vantage points, observing how different social positions created different experiences of identical circumstances. Students can walk through ancient cities, observe political assemblies, and experience historical battles while maintaining emotional distance necessary for analytical thinking. Changing geopolitical relationships will continue influencing historical narratives as nations reassess their roles in global affairs and seek to understand how past decisions affect contemporary international relationships. Regional conflicts create pressure for educational systems to present historical events that support current political positions or justify contemporary policy decisions. Democratic transitions in various countries prompt curriculum revisions that acknowledge previously suppressed historical events, while authoritarian consolidation often leads to renewed historical manipulation efforts. International migration patterns bring students with different historical knowledge into the same educational systems, creating opportunities for cross-cultural historical discussion and challenges for teachers managing diverse classroom perspectives. International cooperation initiatives designed to prevent educational manipulation focus on creating transparent systems for curriculum development and providing resources for teachers facing political pressure. Organizations like the International Association of History Teachers now coordinate rapid response networks that support educators threatened with discipline for presenting evidence-based historical instruction. Cross-border collaboration enables teachers to access alternative sources and perspectives when domestic political conditions limit their curriculum options. Exchange programs for educators provide training opportunities that strengthen resistance to political manipulation while improving teaching techniques for controversial subjects. Multiple indicators suggest that honest historical education gains acceptance globally despite ongoing resistance from political groups seeking to control historical narratives. Student surveys show increasing demand for comprehensive historical instruction that addresses difficult topics rather than avoiding them. Parents increasingly support educational approaches that prepare their children for international environments where knowledge of diverse historical perspectives becomes essential. International assessments demonstrate that countries teaching controversial history achieve higher overall historical literacy rates. Professional organizations report growing teacher confidence in presenting complex historical interpretations. These trends indicate movement toward educational honesty, driven by recognition that avoiding difficult history fails to serve student needs or democratic society requirements. The transformation requires sustained effort, but shows promising momentum that will ultimately determine what kind of citizens and leaders emerge from today's classrooms. These educational transformations will determine whether future generations possess the analytical skills necessary to recognize dangerous political patterns before they escalate into violence. The students sitting in classrooms today will become the leaders making crucial decisions in 20 years. How we teach them about genocide, colonialism, and historical injustices directly influences their capacity to identify similar developments and prevent future atrocities. The global movement toward honest historical education represents genuine hope for breaking cycles of violence and oppression that have plagued human societies for centuries. Germany's approach demonstrates how confronting difficult history creates citizens capable of protecting democratic values and human rights. When students learn comprehensive accounts of past mistakes rather than sanitized versions, they develop critical thinking skills necessary for informed citizenship in complex